that we are going to start. How COVID-19 has changed the world economy. And Jacob, I'm very pleased that you have agreed to share the sessions. Maybe before I give you the floor back, let me maybe introduce to you to our audience and our panelists. You know, you have been governor of the Bank of Israel. You have been vice chairman of JP Morgan Chase International for many years, and the chairman of the board of trustees of the G30. And now you are sharing also the Franklin Zuckerman Institute for Global Economics. You have a long and distinguished career in global economy, in global finance, and providing, you know, strong intellect among policymakers, academic on the global finance and the global financial architecture. I'm very pleased that you can join us today to share not only these sessions, but also to co-host this conference, to try really, as you mentioned at the beginning, not only to call for actions to redefine and to redesign the global economy. Jacob, over to you for sharing the sessions. And I welcome also all our panelists, Richard Koo, Professor Andres Rodriguez-Paz, Andrei Klepach, Kiao Ide from China, and Professor Jacques Sapil from Paris. Welcome all of you, and thank you for accepting our invitation. Jacob.
Thank you very much. And now that we have had lengthy opening remarks, we can jump straight to the water. We will not spend much time in introducing the speakers. Their bios are in the side, in the documents that were circulated to you. But I will only say that we are fortunate to have a fantastic cast of speakers that will enrich our knowledge. Our time is limited, like always in life, and we have 5 presentations, and we need to conclude in about, we will give each presentation about, say, about 12, 13 minutes or whatever, in order to make sure that we reach on time as we move on. I cannot promise you a coffee break, but I can promise you the freedom to take coffee wherever you sit. The first speaker, as appropriately, because I think of this as being now in the global world, I will go to Andrei Klepach, who is well, he's of course he's now the chief economist of the State Development Corporation in Russia, has had a very distinguished career in economic policy, has covered the main important challenges of economy, whether it is from inflation, etc. You can read about his bio, and without any further ado, I will go directly to Mr. Klepach. Please, the floor is yours. Go ahead. The word that has been always mentioned in the context of these Zoom meetings is, please unmute yourself. Mr. Klepach, I saw him earlier. We'll give it one more minute, and if
Андрей Николаевич, вы нас слышите? Вы можете начать первым выступать?
Да, я слышу.
Okay, now, very good. The floor is yours. And by the way, you can choose which language you listen to. There is the simultaneous translation. Please.
Okay. Dear colleagues, it's a big honor for me to participate in such conference and discuss with you the problem of global economy. But I try maybe focus on, especially on the situation in Russian economy, some lesson of our adaptation to the pandemic and world crisis. Maybe I will continue in Russian, but if it's more comfortable for you, I can back to English. Российская экономика, как и экономики.
Russian economy, same as the other countries' economies, have encountered a big impact from the pandemic. But in Russia, of great importance is the fall of the oil prices, since we are exporting oil, and the decline of consumption of oil was caused by the global economic crisis. Hence, we've joined APEC agreement to cut down the oil production. Well, in this situation, in general, I would say that we've passed this crisis with losses smaller than it was expected in the beginning and even in the end of the year. The first assessment of the Russia's decline of GDP is 3.1%. This info was provided by the Russian Statistics Agency. Now the economy has already started to revive. Disregarding the second wave of pandemic, a more severe wave that took place in autumn, there was no
Поэтому в целом
further decline of economy. The situation wasn't as bad as in the European countries. So in general, the economy went out of crisis better than we earlier expected. Well, scale-wise, our crisis was the warranty measures was from 3 to 4% of GDP. It's much less than the EU countries spent on support and stabilization. The support was mainly aimed to help the families, to help those who have lost their jobs. And there was also the small business, support of the small business. This set of measures was rather standard in Russia to speed up the process of bringing the money or the funds to the population. Very direct support was organized for families with many children, because if they lose jobs, the parents lose jobs, it's quite a big problem for the family. Also, there was a system for support of small business, and we also supported the big enterprises to support the employment level. And the National Bank provided guarantees from the government, and some crediting was organized. I wouldn't say any special know-how was involved, but perhaps the biggest difference from European countries was that we didn't have a very strict lockdown. Well, yes, some public activities were closed. First, the restaurants were closed and the cafes, then the entertainment events were banned. But as for the industry, it kept working. Some personnel started to work remotely. However, the work continued at industrial enterprises in construction. We continued especially building roads and housing. However, there was a decline in economy, and according to the preliminary assessment, it's going to be specified later on, the real income of population went down by 3.5%. Without those supportive measures, this figure would be over 5%. The investments went down by 4.2%, and that's a capital accumulation. And in retail sales, it was a 3.1% decline. So I would say that the supportive measures added some 2% of the GDP. However, if we talk about the lessons learned and future prospects, one of the main questions and challenges is how well the economy shall be able to recover up to the pre-crisis level when the losses of income of population shall be compensated and where the entrepreneurship confidence shall get restored. The official forecast is pretty optimistic, and the IMF forecast is pretty close to it. That is, the growth shall be weaker, a bit over 2%, and that will be not due to the consumers' demand. It will get restored, and the population income throughout the year 21 shall compensate the decline of the year 20, but the investment behavior of enterprises, of business, shall remain rather cautious disregarding the investments. The companies supported by the government like Gazprom, the Russian railroads, the oil business shall be okay. As for the private business, I believe it's not yet ready to make big investments, though there's a special package of measures. And nowadays, some additional incentives are developed by the government aimed at the economic development. We have a plan of economic growth restoration, and now we are working on preparation of those strategic solutions that will modify the economy quality. It will become more technological and innovative. Thus, we shall form a new social contract. The healthcare services shall be of high quality, social support shall be better. We're not quite sure about specific parameters of these suggestions. We're now working on this, but the experts believe that already this year some additional measures shall be provided to support the population. Say the pensions shall be increased. For many years we're discussing the retirement or pension reform, and nothing is coordinated finally yet. Also, the investment activity shall be supported via the law adopted on protection of private business investments. It enables them to create long-term contracts, to sign long-term contracts with the companies who are planning big investment projects. And that will create new jobs in particular. I believe in spring, those plans of the government of this new strategic rise of Russian economy shall get more detailed or determined, and then we'll be able to assess whether they're really serviceable and whether they can resolve the social problems. I'd like to drive your attention to two more issues. Pandemic has proved that the healthcare system is rather vulnerable, same as the human life in our world. And sometimes this vulnerability is not in any relation to how much countries are spending for healthcare, like 17% in the United States. In Russia, before crisis, it was 5.6% of the GDP that we've spent on medicine. Nowadays, thanks to the additional measures, we spend up to 7% of our GDP on healthcare. But it's not that important how much is spent on healthcare. We do believe that our healthcare system is underfinanced. It depends on how well organized is the healthcare system work, how well coordinated they are in declining the morbidity and mortality. Russia looks not so bad in comparison with the other countries, European countries in particular. Some 2.6% of our population got sick with COVID. That's according to the data from the beginning of February. As for the mortality level, it was 1.9%. That's much lower than in most of the European countries. There are some problems with statistics in this regard. However, it's not so easy to provide the finished precise calculations. But I believe all the countries should learn on these lessons and learn about the development of the healthcare, making it more patient-oriented. Well, we have lost the skills of fighting the pandemics. Yes, there was SARS and other pandemics, smaller ones before, but such a big different epidemics earlier. But this big pandemic didn't have such an experience earlier. So how can we restructure healthcare so that it's more accessible for mass population, because of pandemic and the disease kills both the poor and the rich. So our debts are not that big. It's 200% of the GDP. GDP or more, or else. But the question is, how can we answer the challenges, including environmental ones? What the EU they do, the Green Deal. The question is how we can save human lives. Since this pandemic, I'm afraid, will not be only the last strategy in this world. Perhaps we should restructure the healthcare system in general so that the healthcare system works on the support of human immune system, and this should be related to the restructuring of the agricultural centers, since modern agriculture depends on growth and stimulators for both plants and animals. They use antibiotics. Thus, eating this food, we kill our immune system. Hence, we should think about the new economy and new quality of healthcare. We should switch to the economy that will take care of not only of preserving the future, but of preserving the humanity as well. That's it.
Thank you very much for helping us understand the perspective from Russia. And we move on to Professor André Rodriguez-Pose, who is a professor of economic geography at the London School of Economics. He is probably one of the most distinguished scholars in this area. He is the past president of the Regional Science Association International. He has been advisor to numerous bodies in the European Commission, the World Bank, the OECD, etc. And he has earned some of the most important prizes and awards in this area. He is the editor of Economic Geography, which is a very important publication in this field. And as we are all used to think in terms of nation states and policy making, his presentation will illuminate to us the role of regions, cities, and the like. So, Professor Rodriguez-Pose, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Frankel. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you at this distinguished conference. And as you have said, my intention is to talk today about the geographical implications of the pandemic, and especially not the pandemic at the moment, but what is going to happen in the post-pandemic world, because, there will be an end to the pandemic. Let's hope it's sooner rather than later. And we'll have to deal with it, but we have to start preparing now. We cannot wait. So let me just share my screen with all of you to put my presentation online. And there it is. I hope you can see it. So I'm going to start by highlighting that the pandemic is having at the moment severe geographical implications. It has presented a challenge, and it's a challenge that is different from previous pandemics. COVID-19 is not the first pandemic to strike the world. There have been in the past in history bigger, more deadlier pandemics in relative terms, but also in absolute terms. And the most recent that we have had in this respect has been the pandemic that took place with the so-called Spanish flu about a century ago. But that was a very different pandemic, because COVID-19 is very much the first one to do so, to strike the world in such a global way, in what is a much more connected, digital and globalized world. And very often the big spreaders, the entry points and the diffusers of the pandemic in different countries and in different parts of the world have been the main cities. The idea that these cities are the air hubs, so the entry points for international travelers that might have gotten infected somewhere else, and then through their density, through their sheer concentration of people, have become spreaders of the pandemic within our countries, have implied that for many, cities are becoming or are facing a turning point. Over the last 3 to 4 decades across the world, what we have seen has been a massive concentration of economic activities in cities, but not just in any city, mostly in very large cities. And for many, and there have been quite a few commentators that have highlighted that this might have been the death of the large city as we know it, that in a post-pandemic world, there's going to be a more even distribution of economic activity in which there is more transfer of, more spread of activity trying to flee these hot points of contagion. So the idea is that the pandemic might be, despite all its toll, negative toll and deadly toll, represent an opportunity for a more balanced growth in which smaller, more remote locations, even rural areas that have lost out in the past, might be offering better opportunities, not just to protect oneself from this and future pandemics, but also to attract and generate new economic activity. But one of the things that we have to highlight, and this is a map of what's happening in Western Europe at a national level, and this is from the first wave of the pandemic, the first 6 months of 2020, is that the impact of the pandemic is very uneven. Yes, there are some big cities like Milan, like Madrid, like London, like Stockholm, like Paris, that have suffered a great incidence of the pandemic. But it has also affected some areas with, let's say, medium-sized cities, smaller cities, or rural areas, like, for example, Alsace in France, or Castile and Leon, or the Northwest and the West Midlands in the UK. And when we go into more detailed analysis per region, and this is for the first 27 weeks of 2020, we see that, yes, these are in the European Union, the 6 regions that had the biggest excess mortality. And it does affect many big cities. Madrid, Lombardy with Milan, London, Catalonia with Barcelona, or Stockholm are amongst the top, together with Castilla-La Mancha, which is a region to the south and the southeast of Madrid. But not all big cities and not all regions have been affected in the same way. In fact, when we take a look at what happened within the European Union, we find that 40% of all regions during the first wave of the pandemic had less excess mortality than in previous 5 years, whereas in some others it was more than 60% in terms of excess mortality. And many big cities, like, for example, the capital city of Denmark, Copenhagen, but also Warsaw, Lisbon, Berlin, Lazio with Rome, and Campania with Naples, were highly affected by the first wave. Of course, with second and third waves, the third wave ongoing, perhaps let's hope not, more waves, the geography is shifting all the time, but it doesn't affect all places. It is very much related to preparedness, to capacity, to react to how good your health care system, to how good your response has been. So what is this going to imply for the future geography of cities? And what I'm going to cities and regions, and what I'm going to highlight here is that there are several forces of change that are associated to the pandemic. The first one is what is known as the social scarring. What is the social scarring? Is that the pandemic is instilling psychological fear and changes in many of us. We are behaving in different ways that we did before, and some people may have enduring sort of fear of crowds and being in large groups of contact. So that might lead to a significant change. I would say that for most of us, social scarring, the fact that at the moment we are reluctant to hug other people, to go close to other people, it's probably going to fade away as soon as the pandemic goes over. But for some people, it might last and it might have relatively enduring sort of impact. There's going to be also changes that might be somewhat longer lasting in order to maintain social distance. It's difficult to imagine that at least in the short term, even after the pandemic is gone and infection is reduced to a minimum, or it becomes something that we can control with the vaccination that is ongoing in many countries on the world, there's going to be also changes that are going to still keep people socially distanced to a greater extent than what it was before. But probably the most important change is the forced social experiment that came with the pandemic. The idea that we had to go in Western Europe, in Wuhan, it was in January, but in Western Europe, it was in the first weeks to mid-March of 2020, we had to go into a system of lockdowns that has changed our life. Jacob Frenkel said at the beginning, well, we are having a very different type of conference. We're having a virtual conference. That probably was not something that would have imagined before, but it has changed the way we work, the way we shop, the way we interact in ways that we could have predicted beforehand. So this is not something that is completely new. These were trends that were ongoing, but we all imagined whether we're going to take years, if not decades. Well, the change took place, and it took place within days. And in many cases, we have realized that things they have changed, and they can change in radical ways and very quickly. We have changed the way we shop. It's not that online retail was non-existent before. It was important, but it has grown before, and it has grown much more over the last year. I'm going to put some examples. Even before the pandemic, in a country like Norway, retail shopping, high street retail shopping in 2019 grew by 0%. Online shopping had already grown by 40% in that very year. Now that has improved massively, or that has increased massively. People are shifting to online shopping in droves. We're changing the way we work. I am in academia, and I've been for a year now just doing lectures, much to my regret, I must admit, but it's online. Like my wife, who works for a main bank, has been working online with the exception of a few days that she has to go into the office. And of course, we are changing the way we interact and we relate to one another.
Yes,
in which we are moving towards issues like, for example, more online interaction, not just on online conferences, but also in the way we interact with friends and we meet. Maybe there's a Zoom fatigue, but Zoom and other alternatives of remote interacting are going to be here for quite some time. And this is having implications that are extremely geographical. What about changes in the way we shop? Well, changes in the way we shop are going to influence and are going to accelerate what my colleague Richard Florida was highlighting, that this is the ongoing high street apocalypse, the retail apocalypse, in which you will see that many commerces, mainly small businesses in city centres, are going to suffer. This is an image from this year in the UK, in which you can see boarded shops because clients have stayed away and they have turned massively to online shopping. It's not that after the pandemic, we're not going to go back to the office, but there's going to be a change. We have realized that we can work, and we can work in many sectors productively from a distance. So probably the return to the office is not going to be full-time, it's going to be mixed, in which in many sectors, and especially in many of those areas that have been identified as having sectors with big capacity to actually work remotely, which are mainly, again, the big cities, what we're going to see is that there are going to be mixed systems. There's going to be 20, 30, 40%, maximum 50% probably of the population in the office on any given day, which is going to have changes to, for example, how much office space we need in cities, and also is going to have changes to the way we transport, the use of public transport, etc. So there's going to be a shift in patterns in the way we work. And of course, if there's less shopping in city centers, if there's less need for office space, there's going to be changes not only to leisure and leisure activities and how we go, where we meet, whether we need to go into the center all the time for social activities, for cultural activities, but also in the need for real estate and housing space in city centers. So overall, this is going to have important impacts on territories. And what are these impacts likely to be? Well, some have predicted, as I said at the very beginning, that this is going to lead to a more even geography. that the concentration in big cities that we have seen in recent decades, especially over the last 3 to 4 decades, the winner-take-all geography of big cities and many areas lagging behind, losing out, is going to be solved as if by magic by the pandemic. That the pandemic and remote working is going to allow people to just move out of Madrid, move out of Paris, move out of Moscow, for example, and decide to go and work in other types of cities, let's say Nizhny Novgorod, for example, or even in rural areas with probably the same efficacy. The people I work with and myself, we are a bit skeptical that this is going to happen. Why? Because first, in terms of remote working, there are some areas that are highly capable of having large sectors of the population working remotely, and those tend to be the big cities. When you take a look at the list that the OECD has prepared of regions and cities that are prepared to work online, we find that the top ones are cities like London, Washington, San Francisco, Brussels, Frankfurt, which are slightly above 50%. Many regions of countries like Italy, Turkey, Greece, Spain, even where you have a concentration, you hardly go about 20%. So probably this idea that the advantages in terms of positive externalities or large pools of labor of big cities are going to disappear is probably not going to happen. Big cities, and many of them, of course, with different performances, are going to steam ahead. So the gap between big cities and medium-sized cities, towns, and especially rural areas may continue to grow. It's not that certain medium-sized cities, towns, and rural areas are not going to benefit. But in general, these are going to be those that have the greatest amenities and the easiest connectivity to large urban areas. Most other, especially rural areas, remote, isolated, with sectors that have been declining over time, probably will continue to lose out. So in that respect, it's not that we're going to have to do away with the policies to make sure that we try to promote economic development in areas that have been declining in the past, because the pandemic is not going to solve the problem. In terms of the microgeography, what happens within large urban areas, what we're going to see is a different sort of ball game. Probably in the short term, city centers are going to change. There's going to be less need for office space, there's going to be less need for commercial space, and there's going to be less need for cultural space. There's probably going to be, as a result of all that, less need in city centers, large city centers, for housing space. This might have implications for real estate prices. This might have implications for functional sort of uses. There will be probably more need for outdoor space and less need for transport, but more for alternative transports. So what we're going to see is probably a transformation of moving away at the first of heavy economic activity, so the headquarters of many firms, etc., that moving to not outside the cities, but to the suburbs of those cities, as would be a lot of commercial activity, although even commercial activity in the suburbs might suffer to online retail. And this is forcing us to rethink how our big cities and our cities will work. There are a lot of proposals. There's this whole idea, you're going to have it tomorrow, about the 15-minute city, but also we're going to have to look into open cities, more creative cities, leisure cities and how they work. We're going to have to look into new residential uses. If at the beginning, the city center suffers a slight crisis, that offers opportunities for new types of activities to come into the cities, for new types of people. There might be more emphasis on the cultural dimension of the city as a meeting point, more than the city as a center for economic activity, which can redefine the city center, but also the whole functional urban area in areas that are not less productive, but productive in a very, very different way. So when we put all together, what we have is a situation in which the pandemic is posing a lot of challenges. The pandemic demands responses. The pandemic is accelerating in many ways transformations that were already ongoing, and we need to act. And we need to act in different ways with respect to changes between different territories, what happens. So not just make sure that we continue with policies that would maximize and tap into the potential of every territory within our countries in order to avoid not just economic waste, but also more sustainable economic, social, and environmental development, but also to make sure that the rising discontent that we have witnessed in many parts of the world doesn't become entrenched, but also we're going to have to think about more imaginative solutions in order to transform the way our cities work and then the way our cities behave, and to make sure that a post-pandemic world brings not just more prosperity, but greater prosperity and well-being for all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andre. This was, as expected, highly illuminating. So as we travel geographically from one country to the other, we move now across the Pacific to Japan, to our very good friend and colleague, Richard Koo, who is now the chief economist of Nomura Research Institute. He has been there for a while. And the fact that we have been analyzing many of our financial crises using the language of balance sheet recession is due to his insights, first developed in the post-1990 Japanese crisis, and then applied further to the post-2007 Western economies. So thank you, Richard, for putting this concept into our intellectual terminology and concepts. Richard is a very sought after speaker. He has published many books, The Lessons from Japan's Great Recession, The Holy Grail of Macroeconomics, and more recently, The Fate of Globalization, is something that is describing his insights very well. And this is the time to ask you, Richard, who has built up his intellectual career at the University of Berkeley and then Johns Hopkins and then at the Federal Reserve, please address us on the subject. The floor is yours, 12 minutes.
Thank you very much. And so nice to be with you again, Franco, on about the same time last year. We were supposed to be meeting in Italy, but well, I had some prepared remarks, but just to comment on the previous speakers about all the changes in the cities and so forth, I happened to got stuck in Taiwan for 8 months because I went to Taiwan for business and I couldn't come back because of the suddenly Japanese government put on this massive restrictions on foreigners coming back, even for those with a permanent residency. So I was stuck there for 8 months, and I have to say that Taiwanese government did a beautiful job of containing coronavirus. In the country of 24 million people, a democratic country of 24 million people, the total number of cases is 933. Total death, only 9 in more than 1 year. So if the government does things correctly at the very beginning, a lot of the things that we are talking about now may not have to, really didn't have to happen. In the last 6 months or so that I was there, I was able to come back to Japan in October. Everything was back to normal. Restaurants crowded as ever. Everything is back to normal. Of course, no international travel under the circumstances, but those countries that did very well were those ones that were affected by SARS epidemic 17 years earlier. So they learned the lesson. And so when this thing happened, they acted very, very quickly from the very beginning. And so I think that's another thing that we have to put into our calculations on how the cities may evolve and so forth. Because if they did it correctly from the very beginning, maybe many of these things could have been avoided, as Taiwanese proved, even in a democratic country. Now, let me go back to the original topic of how COVID-19 changed the world economy. I think that one of the most immediate impact of COVID-19 is that we got rid of Donald Trump. Because just a year ago, if you remember, US unemployment rate was 3.5%, the lowest in 50 years. and stock market all-time high. The guy almost looked unbeatable. But he screwed up so badly on COVID-19 that now he's gone. And that shows that this is COVID-19 doing something for the United States and for the rest of the world. But even with that, with such lousy job of containing COVID-19, he got 74 million votes in the United States. And so that's something we have to keep in mind, that someone like that could still get 74 million votes in the United States, because that is going to be with us on the US political scene for years to come. Now, what kind of, I'm not a doctor, so I cannot tell exactly when all of these things will be over, but if the medical part of the solution is behind us, what will await us? Are we going back to the world of that existed before 2020? And the world that existed before 2020 was, as Franco just mentioned, is kind of left over from balance sheet recession, in that private sectors in all these major economies, United States, Eurozone, Japan, they were not borrowing money. They were actually saving money, even at the zero interest rates. And we never learned this in university, textbooks. Zero or negative interest rate, they should be borrowing money, not saving money. But if you can put that chart that I sent you on the exhibit 1, if that is available for people to see. Well, maybe not. Or then I'll just give you the number from Lehman crisis, the most recent period. So a period of over 12 years. The average savings by the private sector, so that's household sector, corporate sector, and financial sector, all taken together, they saved on average 6.5% of GDP at zero interest rates. And in the case of Japan, 8.23%, in the case of Eurozone, 4.7%. They should be borrowing these numbers, not saving these numbers. It's the next page, if you can flip it. Yes, those numbers in circles, those are taken from flow of funds data, and goes back, the part in the orange in the circled areas is the average savings of private sectors in all these economies. And these 6.54, 8.23, or 4.7, these are ridiculous numbers, absolutely ridiculous, because they're facing zero or negative interest rates. And why were they doing it? Because during the bubble days, they leveraged themselves up a lot. Once the bubble burst, asset prices collapsed, liabilities remain, they all realized that their balance sheet's underwater. The balance sheet's underwater means you have to pay down debt. And all these private sectors in advanced countries decide to do just that, increase savings, pay down debt. And once you enter that world, money really is coming back to the banking system, not leaving the banking system. And so you don't get any inflation. No matter how much money you pump into the system, it can go as far as the commercial banks, but not beyond, because it gets stuck. And in the world like this, you need fiscal policy more than monetary policy, because in a national economy, someone is saving money, someone else has to borrow money to keep the economy going. And in usual circumstances, interest rates will adjust so that you have, you make sure that savers and borrowers, they match at the end of the day. But when we have a situation like this, as I show you these numbers, when private sector is saving 6.5% of GDP at zero interest rates, the two sides are not matching. And then the government has to come in as the borrower of last resort, not lender of last resort like the central bank, but has to be a borrower of last resort to keep the economies going. And that's the world we lived in Japan for more than 20, almost 30 years, and in the United States and Europe for the last 12 years. And if we are going back to a world like this, then I don't think we will have to worry too much about inflation, because money will be mostly stuck in the financial sector. We could end up seeing some mini bubbles, and we're already seeing some mini bubbles in various asset classes. But big inflation is highly unlikely if we enter returning to that world. And there's another reason to believe that we may return to that world, because all these companies that were hurt and households that were hurt during this pandemic, they will be saying to themselves that we'll never be caught short of savings again, that we should have had more savings, because those companies that went bankrupt are the ones that didn't have enough savings. So my guess is that households will increase savings, companies will increase savings, and that will probably slow down the economy to some degree. Of course, before we get there, as soon as medical problems are over, I'm sure we're going to have 3 to 6 months of parties after parties where everybody will come out and start spending money. But once that adjustment period is over, and then we kind of go back to a kind of a steady state world, my guess is that a lot of companies, a lot of households will be start saying, okay, let's have some savings just in case something goes wrong again. And that's against the culture, especially in the Western world of late, because when companies have a lot of savings, Wall Street types, shareholders will bash them for having too much savings. That's suboptimal use of capital. You should fully invest them or give back to the shareholders. Well, those companies that listen to that kind of talk probably went bankrupt during this pandemic. And so the whole culture in the financial market could change also, that you're not supposed to borrow money to buy back your shares, things like that. So those are the changes I see going forward. And one point that on a slightly longer term, the greatest story for the last 30, 40 years, economic story the last 30, 40 years, I think, has been China. And in 2 previous crises, China helped us a lot. For example, Asian currency crisis. China did not devalue, held on, even though it was really painful for the Chinese economy, but held on, and so that Asian currency will not have to fall all that much more. And so that China played a very important role in keeping the crisis from getting worse. And after the Lehman crisis, China also did this 4 trillion yuan renminbi package, which of course, at the end of the day, turned out to be a little bigger than supposed to be, but it played a huge role in keeping many developing countries going, because China kept on buying materials and so forth. But this time, we are seeing this US-China confrontation, and we are hearing this world decoupling on both sides, in Washington and in Beijing. And this is very, very worrisome, because what that means is that China really cannot play that kind of role any longer. And furthermore, decoupling means not rely on foreign markets, especially Western markets. But when you look at the size of Western markets relative to the global world, and if you could change the slides to the next one, Exhibit 2. The so-called Western world accounts for like 56% of world GDP, and per capita GDP is like $52,000, almost $53,000. If China removes itself from this, what's left is, of course, there'll be China, the domestic market, and what may be called the non-West market. But in both cases, per capita GDP is $10,000 or so, and it's a much more smaller market. And when I'm listening to the debate in China, I sense that they're talking about, can we make these products? Do we have all these IC chips capabilities and so forth? And it happens in many countries that politicians will talk about whether it's possible to do it, whether they can make it. But we economists should ask also whether there are someone who is willing to buy this stuff. Because too often, having capability of building them is no guarantee for economic growth. For economic growth, someone else has to buy this stuff. And I sense a similar development in Japan 30 years ago. When Japan and Japan and the United States had this horrible trade friction, and I was actually in the middle of it. the Japanese side, especially this famous mayor of Tokyo, Mr. Ishihara, who wrote this book, Japan That Can Say No, openly argue that, well, if Americans don't want to buy our IC chips, we can always sell these to the Soviets. And I'm sure they would love to buy our IC chips for their fighter planes and so forth. And he actually had quite a few followings in Japan and say, yeah, we don't have to listen to all these American demand and this and that. We can sell to the other guys. But I was on the opposite side of this debate. So I confronted Mr. Ishihara on one event and said, I'm sure a Soviet military would love to buy your Japanese IC chips. But how about the cars and appliances and all of that stuff? Japan is sending something like 1.7 million cars to the United States almost every year. But to expect Soviet Russia to buy 1.7 million Toyotas and Nissans, that's completely unattainable. And once I start making that argument, we need markets, not just technology, but the markets for economy to move forward. A Japanese government did not listen to Ishihara's kind of argument and stayed with the US market. I see that in China, we hear a lot of talk about great circulations or double circulation and all these talks, but they seem to be too concentrated on whether they have the ability to make those goods. And of course, those are important. I mean, if you cannot produce anything, you have nothing to sell. And all these programs about Made in China 2025, all those things were, of course, designed to upgrade the production system in China. But from economist point of view, I really want to emphasize that markets are important. If you don't have a market, no matter how great your products are, the economy won't grow. And I hope debate in China will look into these, whether there's enough customers for what they are making, so that the economy can continue to grow. Also, to reach those markets, you have to have a good relationship. And I was told that Deng Xiaoping, the one who opened the Chinese market, he did not just open the Chinese market. At that time, back in 1978, I was told that China had as many as 16 territorial disputes. Dispute with Japan, dispute with this, dispute with that. Mr. Deng Xiaoping solved 14 of them on the spot. So only 2 left. Maybe Senkaku with Japan and Taiwan, a few other issues left. But all the other ones, he resolved it. And that made everyone feeling peace with China. So all these developments started, all these companies start putting factories in China and so forth. But we see a different move now. Seems like all the territorial disputes are back on the stage again. And sometimes even with more military threats and so forth. So I really hope that at least economists in China will say, this is not where we can continue economic development, that if we continue this route, everyone will be hurt. Certainly people who depended on Chinese products abroad, but I think also Chinese themselves will see much slower growth. And that is not good for the world economy, especially when in the last 40 years, the world economy depended so much on Chinese economic growth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you already laid the ground for us transitioning into China. We are going to have several presentations emanating from scholars from China in this session and also in subsequent sessions. So this brings me now to our next speaker, and I'm cognizant of time. We will need to, in a way, start being more conscious about the time limitation. So our next speaker is Yide Kuao. He is the Vice Chairman and Secretary General of Shanghai Development Research Foundation, SDRF, and he's also the Executive Director of China International Finance Forum 30. He coming with us with great experience. He has spent some time at the Kennedy School and then at the Harvard Institute. He has spent a lot of effort in the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences and has produced some important books about the Chinese economy in the next 30 years, which was published almost 10 years ago, and then series of more books about reform of the international monetary system, about how to rethink the international system, global financial governance. In short, he has thought about the topics that we are dealing with today. So please, it gives me privilege to ask you, Mr. Kyaw, to take the floor, and please unmute yourself. Go ahead. Unmute yourself. You are unmute yourself. Can somebody in the center unmute him? At the lower corner of your screen, there is a button that you need to touch and it will be unmuting you.
Can you hear me?
Now we hear you very well.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, very good.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. Thank you for your nice introduction. Also, I'm very happy and honored to participate in the International Symposium. Particularly, I'm happy to make my presentation following Richard Koo, who did mention the case of China. So today I'm going to talk about the impact pandemic on Chinese economy from Chinese perspective. Obviously, everyone knows pandemic have a great negative impact on Chinese economy. As you know, last year, the growth, the GDP growth rate in China has been worse in past 2 or 3 decades, which is only 2.3%. But at the same time, it's the only large economy which get a positive growth rate. Not because, the reason is because the other large economy even did worse than in China. So the reason behind that, I guess several reasons. One is China did a good job to contain pandemic. Now currently, most cases have already under control. Only sporadically some pandemic cases appear. So basically, I can say we almost come back normal business, normal life. That's I guess the major reason. Second reason, I guess, Chinese government did a good job in terms of good coordination between fiscal policy and monetary policy. Last year, the Chinese central government increased the fiscal deficit from originally 2 point something to increase to 3.6%, which give a lot of incentive to local governments, to business, to individual. At the same time, of course, the PBOC, central bank, keep a good monetary policy, but still they claim the policy still are normal, not unconventionally a monetary policy. That's from policy perspective. From structure perspective, I guess the export played a tremendous role to promote growth rate in China, which is unexpected at the beginning, particularly the last quarter, due to the increasing demand overseas to small electronic equipment. In this area, China have a tremendous growth of export. Another reason is the investment, particularly government investment in infrastructure. Also, private investment in real estate area. That's the good side. The weakness is consumption. I guess as Richard Koo mentioned, it's very strange. The saving rate everywhere increase, particularly even the interest rates are very low. I guess the reason behind that is because people worry about the possibility of future, their safety of job. They just, go around the flow. They worry about what happens in future. I guess probably that's the reason behind the saving rate keep high. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Very good.
So the next year, I guess Chinese economy still will keep going according estimation of many international organizations like the World Bank and the IMF. Probably China will achieve growth rates between 7 to 8%. Of course, that depends on several factors, economic factors, whether exporters still can keep that kind of growth rate, which is uncertain. Another is if the monetary policy in the United States have changing the direction, just like happened 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago, the capital will flow out of China back to the United States, which will create some uncertainty to Chinese economy. Another uncertainty is the relationship with the US. As Richard Cole said, due to the pandemic, Trump is gone. But due to the pandemic, the relationship between China and the US in last year get from worse to worse. But now Biden administration take regime, we will see what happened in relationship between these two countries. I guess something certain, the Biden wouldn't take the same strategy as a Trump administration, but he say competition will extremely, but he doesn't want conflict. So that set a good base for improving the relationship between US and China, or put the relation on the solid base, on the rational base. I want to give some thoughts on what Richard Koo mentioned, what happened in China. I share his opinion on the reason why China can make a great progress in economic development, make a contribution in past to a crisis. But now the Chinese governments have a little bit adjustment of development strategy. They call dual circulation. I guess we should correctly understand the slogan. Actually, from my perspective, they propose, they call dual certification, actually is defensive, not aggressive in some sense, because they worry about the US cut the relation, particularly in high-tech area. So they want to make progress in high-tech area. I can show you most Chinese economists totally agree with the point Richard Koo mentioned. China should continue and keep open. But you can look at something happen positively. At least China, the leader of China to agree to get the carbon, low carbon. They want to get the neutral carbon in 2030, which just happened recently. They closed the deal, RCEP, with ASEAN country. They closed the deal with the European country in a bilateral investment agreement. That's position I can interpret. Chinese government still want to keep the door open. Of course, in some way, they kind of worry about, maybe too much worry about happen. In some way, a colorful revolution, something happen in other countries. That's, you may argue, it's reasonable or is not reasonable. But I guess that's the whole picture. I do have some idea on reduction of pandemic negative impact on the world economy. As everybody agree, the pandemic wouldn't go away very soon. Hopefully, more people in more countries have a chance to get a vaccine. That will suppress the spread of pandemic at the end. But we should reduce the negative impact during the process. I guess at some point, for example, when 30 or 40% of world population have taken vaccine, it might be a good time for every country to issue a certificate for its citizens traveling internationally. If the certificate has to be accepted by other countries, if the vaccine used to be certified by international organizations like the WHO, that will be very important to give promotion to world economy. Also, as for the tension between US and China, I guess probably the competition will continue, but at least we should take more rational approach to that. Mark, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you very well.
Okay, because due to the issue involved very complicated, we should divide the issue between US China into a multiple level or multiple group. For example, the first level of issue is some issue can be coordinated between US and China, like how to deal with climate change, how to deal with the pandemic. That's the first level. Second level, both sides have to agree some debate on the issue, but both sides can solve that by compromising. The third level is both sides find cannot resolve immediately, but at least they have to have some arrangement to control these debates, not into some war, no matter hot war or cold war. That's the, I guess we can call, that's the multiple level approach to the tension between US and China. If the between US and China can get on the more solid rational base, other concern expressed by Richard Koo, I guess, can be resolved through and easily. So I just stop here.
Thank you very much. And this has been very illuminating, I must say. So much so that we see already that the relationships with China and the role of China in the redefinition and the redesign of the system will be very prominent on our agenda. And this brings me to our next speaker, Jacques Sapil, who has been involved in a lot of public debates. His contributions are well known, and in France, he has contributed to much of the debates at the EHESS in Paris, and subsequently he has published a lot of material. But from and he of course was awarded numerous prizes. His area is not a subject that we normally discuss in these meetings, because he's one of the great experts on the role of military, and he published quite a few books in this area. When it comes to our discussion about the redesign of the system, he was never shy in taking some views that are not always within the consensus about the role of deglobalization, about the role of the euro and how should countries maintain or exit. So I think that this is a good way to present you to our next speaker, Jacques Sapil. Please.
Thank you very much, Jacob. It's a great honor for me to attend and to make a presentation to this symposium. I will first define the context and the scope of my presentation. The COVID-19 epidemic has particularly affected the global economy, as all of us know, but most specifically, it has hit very hard the Eurozone. The second point is that the so-called second wave has created a vacuum in some countries that had before very well managed the wave of spring 2020, like Germany or Portugal, by example. And I think that this is making significant contrast with East Asia, where forecasted GDP growth is probably to recover very faster than in Europe and very faster than in the EU. Then, by the way, there is still very significant difference among EU countries and among Eurozone countries, of course, and this is also a matter of concern. So the end will be, will the EU or the Eurozone is accumulating an historic lag toward Asia in the pandemic context? So the first problem is to assess the COVID-19 double shock. With the spreading of the COVID-19, the world faced a crisis without precedent. And still, the global economy is recovering very slowly, but is still recovering. And it's recovering mostly from the consequences of what could be called the Great Lockdown of March, April 2020, and in Europe, the present lockdown in most of countries. At regional level, however, the picture is quite different, mostly in Europe. The COVID-19 is making for a strong divergence at the regional level. Then let's first have a look onto the latest data which has been published by the IMF on January 21st this year. We could see, of course, that China, India too, and that's quite interesting because India has suffered most of the pandemic, and emerging and developing countries of Asia are developing now or are supposed to develop in the next 2 years very much than what is supposed to develop the Euro area and developed countries, by the way. The usual divergence in GDP growth seems to have been exacerbated by the pandemic, and the rebound slack of advanced economies is to be noted. Not surprisingly, the slack is worse for the EMU, which is not to recoup its 2018 level before 2022. So the second point is to have a look on the growth divergence in Europe. And you can see then first the amount of difference between China is emerging and developing Asia, and then countries from the Eurozone. What's more, it's very, very interesting to assess the divergence between Southern Europe, like Spain, Italy, and countries like Germany. France is probably here, I've been probably here given a much too optimistic a forecast because the expected recovery looks already blurred, and I really think that forecasts for France are probably over-optimistic. Now, what is very important is that inside Europe, the divergence between economy, the German economy, and the four other big economies, that is France, UK, Italy, and Spain, has been very heavily affected, mostly during the second wave, but too, it seems, with the first wave. Now, the industrial production and the COVID-19 impact for the first wave only because the data are not going further than August 2020. Of course, China shows the first drop, but that was to be expected because the pandemic exploded first in China. But what is very interesting is its rate of recovery, and even more when compared to other countries. One country which seems to have weathered the storm quite not better, but less bad than other countries was, of course, Russia. So China has been affected earlier than other countries. China and emerging Asia are recovering much faster. What is very important is to note that some countries like France, which boost the important support to population income, are not doing better than countries which have
global source chain, including the China part, since the arrival of international expert teams.
Than some countries which have much less supported the population. Now, have a look on the retail trade, also first wave. Retail trade statistics are quite interesting because here you can see that China had not, by the end of August of last year, recovered the shock of the pandemic. By the way, some other countries had more or less recovered the shock, and Germany certainly was the country which fared the best. Now, how the European Union and the Eurozone have weathered the COVID-19 pandemic. So, as I have said, lockdowns have been implemented in different European countries, leading to different economic consequences. And what is important also to see is that the second wave of lockdown now seems to have been a bit less destructive than the first one. That's probably the learning effect of the population. People have learned how to live, how to work under this lockdown situation. Also the fact that lockdown have been implemented to a lesser degree during the second wave than during the first. Here we have GDP forecast error and lockdown stringency, the comparison between Europe and other. It's quite interesting to see that some countries of Europe are not only very to the right of the curve as far as lockdown stringency, but very low for GDP forecast error. What is also striking is the situation of Taiwan. As has been said by Professor Richard Koo, Taiwan has been very less affected than other countries, and it's not it's not surprising that the results have been so good, but also South Korea, Hong Kong, Russia. Japan too is not faring too bad. After that, it's quite interesting to see that the USA, at least for the first wave, because we still haven't data for the impact of the second wave, the USA at first doesn't seem to have been so much affected than other countries. Well, it's quite interesting to see that actually no Asian countries, but for India, and of course India is a very, very big country, no Asian countries had a GDP forecast error worse than 10%, when 6 European countries had one. And on the other side, if we are looking country with GDP forecast error of less than 5%, we are to find only two European countries, Sweden and Ireland. And I'm making the guess that Ireland, with the current second wave taking place, is probably going down on this point. On the contrary, a lot of Asian countries, Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan, and a country midway between Asia and Europe had one, that's Russia. An important point is that European countries have tried to protect workers, but the approach has been quite different among countries. Here you can see data for the share of employees and self-employees in monetary compensation. It's quite interesting to see that France has very much protected employees and not so much self-employees people. Actually, France is a country where the highest proportion of employees got government monetary compensation. On the contrary, Cyprus, Cyprus is not a very big country, but Italy, and the size of the Italian GDP is not very far from the size of the French GDP, as much less protected its employees and much more protected people which were self-employed. So this graph is making very clear the difference of approach between countries on this point. Another very important point is the fact that the number of jobs which has been the number of jobs supported by government measure has peaked in April with more or less 30 million of people under government support, and it's probably now going around 10 to 14 million linked to the second wave of the epidemic. Now, we have to look choice. And choice has been far-reaching. The first problem was the temporal mix of measures, that is, the balance between immediate support and the more language assistance to the economy. The second very important problem is the balance between fiscal policy and monetary policy, which was major an issue. And then we can say that if the European Central Bank provided a very effective support, mostly, but not only through the PEPP, it can be said the same from the US, with recovery plan, which has been much debate among European about the European so-called recovery plan, but you have to know that the first impact of the recovery plan are not to take place before the end of summer 2021 at best. I'm saying at best. And I'm still afraid that the first impacts are not to be felt between the end of 2021. A last problem is the fact that debt accumulation is raising the financial stability issue, with a debate taking place about a debt cancellation program. Mrs. Lagarde very firmly opposed that, but nevertheless, this is a debate taking place, and public debate taking place in a lot of countries like France, also Italy, and I expect that this debate is to have very important consequences. So here you can see the difference between the support through fiscal policy and the support through monetary policy. It's very important to say that in countries like France, Italy, Germany, most of the support was done by monetary policy. On the other side, if you are looking to countries like Austria, Greece, Ireland, but even to countries like Luxembourg, the share of the monetary policy was much less than what it was in Italy, Germany, and France. Now, the difference in recovery path in the EU and the Eurozone. While recovery in China has been faster than expected, the global economy long ascended back to pre-pandemic level of activity remain prone to setbacks. That's absolutely obvious. But it can be taken for granted that the European Union and the Eurozone have stalled in relation to the process of economic recovery in Southern Asia. And this stall is quite significant, in the fact that it could herald a form of marginalization of the EU and the Eurozone. This is what is now one of the main centers of global economic growth. The change in relative shares of the world GDP in PPP, of course, was already noticeable, since the 1990s. But the COVID-19 induced a trend which largely exacerbated this situation. So the question which can be asked is, will this break, will the new break is to take place in forthcoming year? Here you have data from 1989 to 2019. Well, you can see, of course, the fall of the G7 group, the rise of emerging and developing Asia. The fact that the European Union went down to nearly, around 24% to around 15%, and the fact that also advanced economies like Canada, Australia, were more or less at the same level. Now, what is very interesting is the break of 2020, what you can see is the fact that emerging and developing Asia went up, and it's quite obvious because the recovery first have been less harder than European country, but also the fact that the recovery took place much earlier. But nevertheless, if we are to have some confidence in this forecast data, the share of the European Union could drop from a bit more than 15% to around 12% by 2022-2023. So, of course, this difference in the path of recovery in economic activity reflects the different strategy for supporting the economy adapted by each country. The volume of support calculated as a percentage of GDP vary widely, but there is also a clear difference between countries that support their economies through bank loans and bank shares, and those who favor budgetary and fiscal action, either through direct subsidies or through tax cuts. Industrial production share in each economy is also playing major role. Then the difference between the recovery trajectories of economic activity in developing Asia and European Union, which was already apparent before the arrival of the second wave of the epidemic. With this second wave, we will have to expect an even greater difference. So in conclusion, we'll first ask the question, is the European Monetary Union and the European Union are dropping into insignificance, into economic insignificance? Share in the world GDP went down from nearly 24% in 1989 to probably around 12% in 2022-2023. Second question, has the euro still grows in some of the countries that have adopted it? The economic situation of Southern Europe is clearly here a matter of concern. Look at the situation in Italy and Spain, where the situation is very bad. Look also to the situation of France. This situation, which in fact actually predates the COVID-19 epidemic, is very evident when we compare the different recovery trajectory of economic activity. And then it is clear that the COVID-19 epidemic has played the role of both revealing and accelerating change that have been noticeable for 10 years now. The shift of the world growth pole to the Atlantic, from the Atlantic zone to the Pacific zone, and more specifically to Southern Asia, seems clearly irreversible today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was very illuminating. So this brings the opening session to converge, and as I connect it to the next session, and there are some questions that have already been sent to us, but in view of the shortage of time, I recommend that we bring it up all in the discussion also of the next session, both together. One of the questions was, for example, what would be, if at all, the implications of US fiscal policy and Fed easing on future inflation? Is there a risk? Is there a danger? Where are we? And this discussion is getting heated up in the US also with interventions of Larry Summers, Janet Yellen, and I know that Mike Buchanan is very interested in this topic. So I think, and Richard Koo, I'm sure, will have a say, which means I think that we will delay this issue to the next session because of time. Let me also say that when I introduced Andrei Klepac, I neglected to remind us his vast record and experience in first in the National Economic Forecasting of the Russian Academy of Science, then as Director of Research Department of the Russian Central Bank, then Executive Director of the Economic Research Foundation Development Center, Head of Macroeconomic Forecasting in the Ministry of Trade, Russian Economic Development Deputy Minister. So, Mr. Klepac, we appreciate very much all the record that you brought with you to your presentation. Spasiba. I would like now to, by way of transition to the next session, only to make an observation. We have discussed a vast range of issues. We have had within few minutes from the opening up to now, interventions from France, Germany, Russia, UK, Japan, China, and I'm now talking to you from Israel. Can we speak about a disintegrated world? Whether we want it or not, we are interconnected. And then we were talking about the different records and experiences of the various countries. And geography matters a bit. Some countries have one entrance, one airport. Some countries have many, many gates. And when you are talking about lockdowns and imported viruses through travel and traffic, some countries can do it, some countries cannot do it. And why isn't it done by countries that can do it? Countries differ in terms of the authorities that government have, in terms of the political will of governments to take occasionally unpopular measures, in terms of the character of populations. I must say some countries have more obedience and more compliance in the DNA and some are not. But the DNA is not something which is genetic. It reflects national experiences. And we were told already that the experience of SARS years ago helped to understand what are the high stakes that are here. We spoke a little bit earlier about the role of science, technology, knowledge, and the message comes from the top. The US, Mexico, Brazil, there were periods at the beginning that the leaders disputed that there is an issue even, let alone seeking for solutions. So I think that the complexity is very important. And if we don't learn from each other, then we are bound to make the mistakes that others have been doing. So this is the role of these series of conferences in order to take stock and move on. And as we move on, we are now moving on with the program. And with your permission, I'm going to invite the second session to take its role. I'm going to transfer the baton to the new chair of the session, Sophia Record, Professor, Head of the Department of World Economy and International Economic Relations, St. Petersburg State University of Economics. It's a great pleasure to be chaired by you, and we will now move to the session on the BRICS. Please stay on, enjoy, and I'll ask those who administer the session to bring the next participants to the stage. Please, thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you very much. I think Sophia will be coming shortly. We will have a 10 minutes digital coffee break, and hopefully one time we will come back to a real coffee break. But 10 minutes coffee break before we start the next session on both the BRIC countries at 20, prospect for acceleration, ? That will be sharing by Sophia Record, who is the head of the Department of World Economy and International Economic Relations at St. Petersburg State University of Economics. And I had the pleasure to work with her over the last few weeks to put together this program. So we will reconvene in 10 minutes. And you can stay, take a coffee, and come back within 10 minutes for the next session. Thank you. And Jacob, thank you very much. And thanks all the panelists and speakers who have participated to this.
I want to
and set the stage.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Be well.